In fact, renewables have become much more affordable, and there's cheap capital around that is looking for a good use. Why is it still not happening faster that we would see this energy transition? I think there's a number of reasons. I think a lot is at stake. These are big industries, the energy industry, the car industry, which are currently going through a transition. And making such a big transition happen in a large industry will always take time. I think the second factor we're seeing is that there is a big political contestation of this transition right now going on, which results in significant policy risk, which keeps investors hesitating because they feel like if they do the wrong decisions today, they might be punished by changing policy frameworks in the future. So having a stable, reliable policy framework is really key to unlock that flow of investment in clean energy. Welcome to St. Gallen. It's my pleasure to open the 8th St. Gallen Forum for Management of Renewable Energies. My name is Prof.Wüstenhagen. I'm the Chair for Management of Renewable Energies here at the University of St. Gallen. And it's my pleasure to welcome you as your host today. The role of policy is changing. In the early days of renewable energies, where renewable energy was a lot more expensive than conventionals, there it was really important that there were generous incentives, policy incentives that would make investors invest in those expensive renewables at the time. Now, with the cost of renewables coming down, approaching grid parity, the role of policy changes. It doesn't have to be as generous as it used to be, but it's even more important that policy is predictable and reliable. So helping investors to be sure what the policy is going to be like tomorrow is an important element. And also to facilitate new business models that look into self-consumption and creating the right framework for that is an important role for policy to play. I'm offering you 4 possible explanations that other people have identified that could explain why the energy transition is not happening more quickly. Policy can be helpful, but it is increasingly not becoming the most important driver. Other drivers are investors are looking for a good place to invest their capital. So in the current low to negative interest rate environment, pension funds are looking for ways to generate returns, safe, not extremely high, but safe and reliable returns for their shareholders. And they are discovering renewable energy infrastructure as a way to generate those long-term returns that they're looking for. And then the other driver is consumers. Consumers, as our consumer barometer in renewable energy showed, to a large extent are worried about climate change. They want to do their share in addressing this important topic of climate change. So they're looking for solutions, and that makes them open-minded about the idea of having solar on the roof, of potentially exploring battery storage, or of switching from conventional cars to electric cars. I think institutional investors tend to be risk-averse. Of course, their purpose of being is to be there for in the long run. And in the past, what served them well was to not take too much risk. Renewable energy, if you look at it closely, actually avoids some of the risk of conventional investments. You don't have fuel price risk, you avoid climate risk, you avoid some of the important risks of the existing energy supply. But in order to come to that conclusion, you have to really understand the sector. And I think that's something where some of the institutional investors are still on the learning curve. So they are trying to figure out what are the risks and opportunities in renewable energy. And as long as they're still on that learning curve, they will continue to be hesitant. But we see in some other countries that where investors have gone through that learning curve, the investment really starts flowing. I think universities, business schools have a role to play here. Things like our executive education program in renewable energy management are one way of helping investors understand the sector better, make sense of the complex drivers that are out there. Also look behind the scenes of things like policy risk, understand where it's coming from, how it can be managed, how to diversify those kinds of risks. So I think there's a strong role to play for business schools in that area. I think diversity is really one of the characteristic features of how the new energy market differs from the old energy market. I mean, this is an industry which for many years has been dominated by national or local monopolies. There wasn't a lot of technological innovation, where there wasn't a lot of gender diversity, not a lot of international diversity. And this is changing dramatically. And more diversity is an opportunity for innovation, but it may also be a challenge for the incumbent firms who aren't necessarily used to dealing with such diversity. So that is why we put it onto the program this year, because we think this diversity is a new reality. You have to deal with it. You have to understand the challenges involved in it. But if you manage it properly, it can actually be a source of innovation. But that, again, for them requires a learning journey. So far, they could easily outsource and just buy electricity from their suppliers, whoever their suppliers were in the given countries. But if they want to kind of take a more active approach, they need to understand which kind of energy to source, how to get it from where it's produced to their sites. Again, we come back to the topic of policy risk. They need to understand how changing political environments will influence their ability to supply themselves with renewables. But more and more companies are actually taking that kind of active approach, and I think that can be an important driver going forward. Policymakers and investors have to strike a balance. Of course, the incumbent companies, they come with a lot of expertise, with existing customer relationships, with all the infrastructure. But if policymakers would only focus on these incumbent players, they would lose the opportunity to harvest some of the innovation that's brought in by new players. So any policy scheme should always try to strike a balance between giving the incumbents an incentive to change, but also helping and harvesting the dynamics of the new companies. I'll give you an example here. The car industry, we talked about electric mobility at the forum. And of course, there's a lot that the incumbent car companies could bring to the table in making electric mobility happen. They know how to mass manufacture cars. They have existing distribution networks. They have very strong marketing departments who know how to sell stuff. But then on the other hand, new companies like Tesla, for example, they bring a lot of entrepreneurial spirit. They really want to make this happen. And if policymakers find a way of combining the best of both worlds here, that's going to make a stronger impact on the transition to electric mobility.